Hi everyone, it's Matt from The Pen Habit, and I'm glad to be back for another video. New pen this time, one that I've actually had in my collection for a while, but haven't had a chance to do much with yet. It is this pen. This is a little pen, Conway Stewart, Model 14. This is a 1950s era pen that I found on eBay. Really quite a pretty acrylic or casein or whatever it's made of. I don't really know, but it's called Burgundy marbled, and it's got quite a bit of depth to it. Very pretty. Now, my background with vintage pens is, if you've watched my videos, can be a little on the spotty side. I've had some good luck. I've had some not good luck. I've had a lot of good luck finding pens. Not a lot of luck in finding pens I really like. This is a pen that I like, but I don't really like, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is, and a little bit about what I had to go through with this pen. Anyway, very pretty pen. It's got the black quote-unquote jewel here on the top of the pen, and then a nice gold clip here, or gold-plated clip with the CS diamond logo on the top of the clip. It's pretty standard, and then it comes down to a diamond-shaped ball on the end. It's got a single ring in the cap, tapers down to a point on the end of the pen here, and it's a screw top pen. Now, as you can see, this is a lever filler pen, and this pen did come to me restored, but not, so I didn't need to replace the lever mechanism or the ink sac. It has an teensy tiny little nib. I mean, this nib is minuscule. So for comparison, here is a standard number 6 size nib. Here is and I believe this is a 1A nib or a 1 nib on Conway Stewart's pens of this era. I mean, it's tiny. And the nib size is actually one of the reasons why I have a little bit of a problem with this pen. Normally, I like to hold my pen a little bit closer to the nib than, up here. But the nib is so small that I can't get my hand onto the section and still have the nib touch the paper. It's just such a short nib. As I mentioned earlier, this is a small pen. It's actually quite a small pen. So it is a 114 millimeters uncapped, and then capped it is 127 millimeters. Now the pen can kind of be posted. It doesn't post very securely, but friction will hold it in place. And because this pen is so short for me, I have to post it. I don't really have a choice here. And this pen is actually relatively comfortable when it's posted to write with, because I'll hold it, you can see down here, I'll hold it up here on the barrel as opposed to down here. Another reason why I feel like I have to hold the pen up here on the barrel is because the section down here at the narrowest point is only 8 millimeters. It's very, very narrow. The barrel is 11.3 millimeters, so it's still a fairly slender pen, but the barrel is a decent size. It's only slightly larger than a lot of the sections I like to use, which are usually about 10 and a half milliliters. The nib is, aside from being just tiny, is a 14 karat gold nib. And Conway Stewart's of this era are not marked with a designation on the nib as far as I can tell. But based on the way this pen writes, I'm fairly certain it's a broad, and I will show you that in the writing sample. Now, when I got this pen, I had some issues with the way that the nib and the feed fit together. Because the nib is so short, so the nib is, and I wish I could pull it out, but I got it in place and I'm not going to touch it. The end of the nib only comes down to about here on the section. It's not a long nib underneath the section. So I had a hard time, it wasn't seated properly in the section, and I had a hard time getting it to stay in place. I put a little pressure on the pen, and the nib would actually rock out because there wasn't enough leverage to keep it in place down there, and or it would rotate around, and there formed a gap between the end of the section, or between the feed and the back of the nib, which meant that the ink wouldn't flow properly a lot of times. I did a little bit of work on the nib over the weekend, and what I ended up doing was a couple of things. So I pulled the nib and the feed out. I took a little Q-tip, pulled the cotton off of it, and dabbed it in some dish soap or dish detergent, and put it on the inside of the nib, just for a tiny bit of lubrication. Then I have a little heat gun. It's a paper embossing heat gun that I got at a craft store. And I heated up the section slightly just to make it expand a tiny little bit. Took the nib and the feed, seated them in there tightly, let it cool. And then once I did that, I heat set the feed. The feed's made of ebonite, so I heat set the feed by taking some nearly boiling water that I nuked in the microwave and holding just the tip of the pen into that water so the feed could adjust itself. I think I need to go through another round of the adjusting of the feed, and I'll explain why when I get to the writing sample. But this is the joy of using vintage pens. If you use vintage pens, chances are at some point or another, you're going to need to learn how to work on them, because vintage pens, unless you buy them from a reputable dealer who generally charges a fair bit of money, you may find that you get pens that aren't in the best of working shape. Now, I will say, I won't mention the name of the person I bought it from. He is a well-known seller, has a lot of Conway Stewarts, does great work normally. Offered to take the pen back, but I didn't want to take the time to ship it back to the UK to have him take a look at it. So I decided to use this pen as an opportunity to learn myself. The other thing I like about these Conway Stewarts that I'm finding is they're actually, for vintage pens, quite affordable. A lot of vintage pens, especially as they get harder to find, aren't very affordable unless you find just an absolute junker and restore it. But you can get a fully restored Conway Stewart with a nice nib in some really, really beautiful finishes for what I consider to be affordable for vintage pens. So I'm going to go ahead now and do a quick little writing sample of this. As I mentioned in an earlier video, as a vintage nib that has been restored and had work done on it, you can't take this as this is what all pens are going to write like, obviously, because every pen is different depending on how it was used in its earlier life. But I just do want to show you a little bit about the pen and how some of the things I'm dealing with it still and need to do a little bit more work with. So that was a really convoluted sentence. I'm going to stop talking and do a writing sample. So here we go. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and post the pen gently. And this is the Conway Stewart, model number 14. And this is a 14 karat nib. And as you can see from the writing, I'm pretty sure this would be considered a broad nib. Whether or not it started life out that way, I don't really know, but it's a broad nib now. The ink for today is Sailor Gentle Epinard, which is it'll probably be hard to tell in the video, kind of a dark, very dark olivey green, or military green. It will look even darker in this pen because it's very, very wet, and I'll show you that in just a little bit. And then we are on a Rhodia dot pad. So our quote for today is, Mr. Picasso. Okay, so the nib is kind of on the stubby side, which I actually found with another Conway Stewart nib that I recently acquired. the nib in my Conway Stewart 24 that I did a video on a while back, I tried adjusting it. The tip broke off, and rather than spending money to get the nib retipped, I found a junker pen that came to me, and it was also a little on the stubby side. And what I mean by that is, you can see here are the downstrokes with really no pressure on them, quite wide downstrokes. Here are the cross strokes with no pressure. So while this, I would not consider this a full stub necessarily, there are certainly some stub-ish tendencies to this nib. So you'll get just a tiny bit of line variation in that respect. I don't know if you can hear this. There's also, it needs a bit of smoothing. I haven't really smoothed it yet. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's not really digging on the paper, but I'm getting a little bit of unpleasant feedback that I'm not just huge fan of. As I mentioned, though, in terms of wetness, this pen is a gusher. With the writing I've done, this pen the ink tends to collect underneath the feed when it's not in use. And so this is one of those pens that doesn't write at the normal ink flow level. As soon as you take the cap off, it'll write really wet for a while and then get down to a regular ink flow. And I've never had it seize up on me or choke, being unable to maintain the flow with my writing. But it does always start off quite a bit more, quite a bit wetter, and then gets back to a normal thing. But with such a broad nib, you almost have to have a wet pen. I mean, this is probably the definition of what someone would consider a juicy nib. So if you've got an ink that likes a wet nib, this is a pen for you. With the 14 karat nib, there is a bit of line variation. Because of the problems I had with the seating of the nib, I don't want to push that too hard. But there is a little bit of line variation. But because the nib is just so small, there's just not a lot of give. The tines aren't very long, so there's just not a lot of give to that gold. You could, if you pushed, you could get a little, but there's really no need to do that. I mean, this nib is stubby enough and flows well enough that it's just not, I don't see the need to try to coax more out of it. Overall, though, I like the pen and I love the material. I really do love the material this pen is made out of. It's a beautiful, beautiful material. It's been polished well. It's in just truly pristine shape for a pen that is 70 years old now, almost, 60, 70 years old. It really is in beautiful shape. The threads are cut nicely. The workmanship is excellent. And I love Conway Stewart pens. I have since I first touched my Conway Stewart Wellington. So I've always had a soft spot in my heart for these pens. It's just a little too small for my hands. This is one, though, despite the fact that it's too small for my hands, I would still use it. The generous ink flow, the really unique, broad, stubbish nib, which I don't have very many nibs like that in my collection, and the history of it. So great pen, really enjoyed it, quite affordable, and it taught me a lot about how to get nibs and feeds to fit together in vintage pens, because I nearly chucked this pen out the window on more than one occasion out of frustration. So that's my review of the Conway Stewart 14 with a broad, stubby nib. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, blah, 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 blah. You've heard the spiel before. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you here next time on The Pen Habit. Bye.